talks about everything creative and design related. This morning we have a very special guest, a very close friend of mine for probably the last 7 to 8 years. He and his partner Justin are the owners of Nistenhaus Design firm. They also own the Warehaus by Nistenhaus and then Warehaus on Cherokee, which is a boutique event space right behind their office space. Michael has worked on a lot of projects for us, and it's been a lot of fun. And they are brilliant in what they do. You'll see in a lot of the work that he shows. But we want to bring him in today to talk about fulfillment through design. And so, without further ado, Michael Wyrock.
Hello. Hello. This is hi. Everyone can hear me, yes. I'm Michael Wyrock. Definitely glad to be here. Fulfillment through design. Definitely something that we're constantly striving for in our business and our industry. And it is, feels like it's aggressively coming at me.
Here for that. Lovely. Thank you so much. So Aaron has already introduced me, so I can skip right into a little bit about me, about our office. For the most part, fulfillment in our industry is one of those things that there is what everyone thinks of as design, and if there's creatives in the audience, we all know that that's something we constantly struggle with, is trying to explain what it means to do our work and do it well. For the most part, most people think, immediately, paint color, design, interior design, paint color, you should be able to pick that out for me, no problem. And that's one of the things that we're constantly trying to figure out how to better say and politely tell people, if I don't know anything about your space, if I've never met you before, me giving you a paint color isn't going to solve all your problems. But it is something that, for many ways, it is definitely something that we are constantly trying to figure out better ways of saying, let me figure more about you and what you want, and then I can pick from this rainbow of color that we have to choose from and really tailor it to something that fits your needs. And for us, it's like picking a star from the sky. If you're looking for the Little Dipper, that's great, and you know that. But if you're looking for a Leo, much like myself, that's something that is very different. So for Nistenhaus, what is that? We started in our backgrounds within architecture, and because of that, the Bauhaus movement is a major force within design, especially within architecture, turn of the century, and dealing with modern design. And with that in mind, we went to kind of the German language, because trying to name a business is kind of like naming a child, I would assume. I don't have one, but guessing from naming animals, it's similar. And for that, we thought, what does it mean to be in our clients' homes? And it's very much about nesting them within their homes. So Nisten, nest, house, house. Nistenhaus became pretty obvious for us in that search for a name. And our very important person in our office, our CFO Mars, Chief Fuzzy Officer. She is kind of the glue that binds our office and also just makes things much more interesting. Yuki, her executive assistant, always plotting to take over her in a very hostile way. But basically, within our office, what we do at Nistenhaus, thank you. What we do at Nistenhaus, we pick paint colors. Just kidding. As Aaron mentioned, Nistenhaus is our main company. Warehaus on Cherokee is kind of this offshoot. We had a really beautiful greenhouse that was attached to our space that we currently rent. And that was something that we were trying to explore. What do we do with this amazing space, and how do we utilize it in a way that is going to really have connection to the community? So that's something that I'll talk about a little bit later. And then the Warehaus is kind of a new introduction for us for how we do business. But for the most part, Nistenhaus is our primary function right now. And for us within this industry, constantly trying to find fulfillment within it, we've tried to boil down what we do to kind of some really isolated items. So architectural solutions, renderings, project management, kitchen and bath design, color consultations, and curated vignettes, and seasonal and holiday decor. All of that, for the most part, if you ever, that's our version of design right now. But as I go through this, you kind of explain that a little bit further in more depth. But for the most part, we are constantly trying to show our clients what it means to do design, what it means to make their space their own. And for us, this is actually our studio kitchen that we put together, which showcases a few different vendors that we can utilize, but also showcases a lot of different materials, both on a high end and low end. There's actually laminate is what you're looking at there, which is always a faux pas for most people. We wanted to put it in to show, hey, I'd rather you put your money into cabinetry and not just spend it on stone. But we'll do both if you want. But for this space, we really tried to showcase lifestyle design and what that means for us, because we currently live here, and then we show it off for clients when they come through. And it is a really easy way for us to present some of the things that we find fulfilling within this industry. And also, it's like, no, we're actually living it. And that is a much easier sell for design than just saying, oh, here's a pretty rendering, here's a pretty image. It's like, no, we live it. And in what we do, we're constantly structuring everything. I think that most professionals, you have to have some structure to, I think, be able to really find meaning in what you do, and then also present that back to someone else who wants to then actually purchase that from you. So for us, finding structure really starts with, the background of, architecture and design. My schooling, going to WashU, one of the things that we were constantly exposed to within that was trying to go through and create this matrix of what it means to be in design, what it means to go through history and look at that. So the images that, we'll call them paintings, that you saw in our apartment, that was a series of drawings done in a material study, and it was going through and more or less isolating the metope for the Parthenon and taking what those actions are and abstracting them, and then using this material study as a way of digging into the actual door panels that I used and actually carving into it, similar to what that would have been in a much less sophisticated way, but really trying to abstract to the point of showing action and showing what it was to create these in a slightly modern way. So going through that type of study of digging down through history, going down and figuring out what structure meant then and what it means now. That's something that I think, for the most part, in my studies, I found myself consistently finding some sort of solution through these structures. And for my thesis study, going through St. Louis history and finding out that the governmental structure of St. Louis is very tangled and very confusing. And if you look to the left image, that was my take on trying to understand, how does government work in St. Louis? And as you can see, it's layered and not entirely the most intuitive situation. So I took that as a starting point for trying to figure out how to really work with the structure of St. Louis to understand what does that mean for design, and what does that mean for my studies within urban design as well. And really going into what that really looked like within the city structure. And you can see that's Forest Park is the big thing that you see there. When you start layering in what all of these governmental buildings are, I was trying to understand, how does government relate back to the city? That starts to show where they are all organized within this kind of larger grid, and then trying to define these lines within the city, and what did that mean for how people relate back to government and structure. It was a really interesting experience to go through it, and of course with St. Louis, there's a lot of division here, and there's systemic racism, there's within the governmental structure, there's many things that it's not a one-size-fits-all conversation, but it was intriguing to go through and see how these lines start to organize, starting with structure, and then actually rendering themselves within reality. And really just creating those foundations for fulfillment. I think that's something that all humans, I think, try to look to where they start and then also build from it. And for many, it may not always be about a governmental structure. Sometimes it starts with schooling. And for me, schooling then becomes that career path. And when going through this presentation, trying to figure out, it's like, how many different career paths have I had? 23, apparently. That was something that was kind of interesting to realize, that my path in finding fulfillment within this industry has not been linear. And I think for many people, I would assume in this audience as well, it is not always linear. And that's something that is kind of interesting to go through and really look at. How does someone get from one place to another? And for some, it might be a little bit easier, but for me, it's not completely strange to look at this web of things and see, dealing with holiday decor as a middle schooler and high schooler with family friends, getting paid to do that. Now I'm doing that still. But in many ways, these different things that have gone through my life and been layered in are something that, I've really been able to build off of. And going from really doing very menial work for most things, being a dishwasher was kind of a foundation, like, it sucks. And I don't want to do that, but I understand that it's important. And then really getting into not wanting to do that type of activity, and then going into sales, being a wedding DJ, doing things that are, fairly, doing the architectural intern work, and then kind of going in from there, and then getting into what it was to really be a designer, trying to get into the world after a recession, and not having work that people wanted to pay you for. That was something that then brought me into sales. And sales, as a part of what we do within our business, it's a huge part of my job within it. And it is something that has been layered within this history of just trying to be in a consumer-based industry and trying to find fulfillment in that in a way that isn't always standard. I don't always look to myself to find fulfillment. I look to what I'm doing in that particular moment. And if someone else is happy, it makes me happy. Obviously, that can be problematic if the person isn't happy. And that's something that is a totally different part of this conversation. But in the schooling approach, as I was going through some of the prior work that I had done in school, there was a project that I had done for a competition, and the word vicissitude, which does not sound like a real word, but I promise you it is. A change or variation occurring in the course of something. Sounds very vague, and it kind of is. But I utilized this idea of trying to combine some of these details that in my schooling over the course of 3 years at WashU, there were definitely different projects that I worked on, and I started to see this kind of web forming of different details that, even though it was a project that was, one on the left being from East St. Louis, another one on the right being in New Orleans, I started finding these patterns of, even though they're, not necessarily worlds apart, but they're definitely geographically different, and they're dealing with very different scenarios. There were so many very similar paths that I saw coming from both, and in many ways, those are things that we can relate. And so that was something that I explored through this this study. And East St. Louis is a place that, and it has gone through many iterations of itself, and dissimilar and similar to New Orleans, the evacuation of its economy and its wealth created a vacuum. And for New Orleans, during Katrina, you have this intrusion of water, which then again creates this vacancy. Those two, to me, did not seem so dramatically different because they caused, even though they're very different stimuli, they caused a very similar result. And for what we do within design, within architecture, the only way I could imagine, how do you heal that? It's about creating community, it's about creating housing, and finding ways of coming up with a typology that would work for both of these spaces to reinvigorate them, to allow them to regrow. It's not an easy conversation, and it's something that for this study was definitely something that was not entirely answered. I did not win this competition that I submitted this for, but it did present a lot of factors that I feel like has application even we do today, and especially when it comes to development. That's one of the reasons I came to St. Louis, was because I really enjoy what this city is and what it was and what it could be. And that is something that I think is still growing, and there's definitely more work to do, but the energy is here for it. And that is like many communities, you kind of have to find this way of stitching all these different paths into one. So in that respect, finding fulfillment through the expectations that you set with yourself, with others, and for us, many times with clients. Not every time that we go through these conversations is it always easy to understand what someone is trying, what their expectations are. And this image, which I'm sure many of you have seen, the client brief, obviously a very lovely drawing of a horse. Client budget, not so lovely, and very much out of line with what their expectation is. We find ourselves dealing with that very frequently within our work. This is another one that I just think is amazing and hilarious. When the client says you can do it for cheaper. Yeah, well, you have the one on the left, that's amazing. The one on the right, that's what they actually get. So in our business, I was in a conversation with a contractor years ago, and he brought up this kind of good, fast, cheap sort of paradigm within construction. And it's something that has stuck with me. And every time I look back at almost every project that we've ever done, if there was successes, it was because this was in alignment. When there were failures, it was because this was out of alignment. And almost every client goes into, or everyone, we all do it. We go into a situation, I want it all. I want the unicorn. And the reality is you can't have it. So if you want to do it fast and good, it's going to be expensive. If you're going to do good and cheap, it's going to be slow. And if it's going to be fast and cheap, it's going to be inferior. And for the most part, all of the projects we work on, we want a certain level of quality out of it. That's why people come to us. So the reality is it's rarely ever fast. But again, that's design. But we try to set those standards for people in our FAQ that we send out to really level set what it means for their project. And we've done these graphics that I think have been really helpful, and often I will find myself relying on these more and more as years have gone by, where it's like, why is this so expensive for doing so little work? Well, because it just takes more time to be more creative and do things on a budget. So those projects where someone wants us just to curate a collection of things on a wall, it just takes a lot of time. Whereas these big projects often don't really feel like that our time is that expensive because they're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it is helpful, I think, in the conversation of just kind of presenting like, this is the reality. This is what it looks like. And we're not afraid or shy away from telling people what things cost, because I think many people in the industry are afraid to say, oh, well, it's going to be expensive. Here's why it's expensive. And I think that explanation and kind of educational component is what we have found success in with many of our clients, or not moving forward with a client because it didn't make sense. So, but we all know if we have clients, you receive that email and they say, we love it. And then you open the email and they say, we love it, but we want to make a few changes. That is always a curse for us within what we do, because you have to stay on track. You have to have all of these things you're factoring in. And for us, in many ways, being within a space where there is also marketing going on, and what that means, the power of persuasion often is embedded with what it means to get inside of someone's psyche. And nostalgia for us is a very powerful drug to really do that and execute on our vision. Being an 80s baby myself, I think it's one of those things that we have found there are a lot of people right now within that kind of segment, millennials specifically, but also the parents of that generation and even beyond. We see a huge uptick, and we have for many years, with mid-century as a movement within the design community, and it is just filtered down where, now here in the Midwest, everyone's like, yeah, I want to do mid-century. I'm like, everyone's been doing it for the last 15 years, and also it already had its moment. But it's cool, you like it, great. But it's based in nostalgia, and I think that's one of the things that, because people think of their parents and their grandparents, and that was a sense of home and a sense of comfort, that is one of the reasons why I think we see that being so prolific right now and being, so iconic. But it also was based in design that I felt more authentic to itself. But when you think of what is nostalgia, for some, holidays are nostalgic. For me, Christmas was such a fun time because I loved Christmas trees. And Christmas trees were my fulfillment as a child. I drew them literally all year long, and they would hang up in my grandparents' house, and still to this day, I love Christmas trees. But Christmas trees, as well as most things in history, are layered. They are not necessarily what we think of, and it is definitely a marketing approach that worked really well thousands of years ago to take certain things from what was layered in history, certain pagan items. They're not necessarily as religiously entwined as people would like to think. And it's amusing that we have this tree that is a pagan fertility symbol. This is what we base this whole holiday around. That's awesome, because ultimately you take these things that someone said this is really something we should focus on and build a holiday, build festivities around, and then it gets layered and intertwined with what so many other spiritual elements, but also just what binds us as a society. That's something that I think is fascinating, of how you can utilize that as a tool to then really create something that's fulfilling for people and something that brings joy. And obviously binding families, there's me in the blue at the bottom. There's something about binding ourselves with family, which then binds us to community. And for many grandparents and other family members, those are people that give us our base and often are what create this sense of just safety and the safety net. And that's what we thoroughly enjoy in our business and industry, is trying to figure out how to craft that for people within their homes. And for ourselves as well. And obviously that is something that when you strongly enjoy and believe in those items, again, I love Christmas trees, clearly, this is our house. But there's ways of working those in and elevating them, and then also being able to take that to bring people into your home. Bring them into your home, share with them what it is that you're enjoying, and then show them what that means in a slightly different way, and really provide community. For us, we also enjoy Halloween, and for that, creating atmosphere, taking something that is very much considered to be very juvenile. I think for the most part, Halloween has seen its resurgence of people just really getting into it, and also it's more in the United States. Didn't quite realize it wasn't outside of it, but in the United States, we've definitely seen that as such an uptick. But Justin and myself find creating these atmospheres in a way that are different than what we have to do for clients. It's something that we can craft and provide an escape from reality. And it's something that we really thoroughly enjoy about the design process. When we look at doing decorations, we're probably looking at it a little differently than some, but it's something that allows for us to create a moment, utilize all of the technique that we use in our everyday, and then find this opportunity to really create a moment for people to be in that place, to be in that moment in time, and actually create a new sort of path for them in that moment. And that is something that we find for many of our clients, this fulfillment through renewal and the idea of reinventing yourself. It is not uncommon when we go into a project, we are meeting that person within a phase of their life where someone has passed away. A family member or a spouse, a loved one, they are no longer in their home, and we find ourselves dealing with the grief of what it is for them in a way that you don't expect. It doesn't come out immediately, because that immediate first meeting, everything's great, and you're not really seeing behind the surface. They're like, I just want to change things up, let it be new. And that is something that I feel like we're always trying to understand where they're coming from. And everyone loves a good before and after. That's the exciting part. But we're going in that before, and that is something that we are having to wade through these memories and things that they built with this person or that person built for them. And in this scenario, this was a client whose wife had passed away. It had been years, and they were ready to change. And we had to tread very lightly for what it meant for them, and we didn't quite realize what we were getting into. The results, I think, were very successful. We were able to get through the process and utilize a lot of the antique pieces and furniture that they had, lived with together. And then also wall coverings is a huge thing for our business. We love wallpaper when it's good. And that's something that, taking that and reimagining that for that client, in the end was very, very successful. And for the most part, I think very fulfilling for us. But it was not always easy trying to figure out what you can touch without question and what things start to open up this wound and create things that you never would think about would be a problem. Moving a picture or putting it in a place where they think you might have gotten rid of it opens it all back up, and they then become much more sensitive with realizing they weren't quite ready for that. Being in someone's bedroom, that's an even more interesting space. But that's also a space that we for renewal, and that's where we go to, I think, find a sense of just finding a sense of getting to the next day. And I think that's something for someone who's lost. I can only imagine that's something that is very important and very critical. And I think they also trusted it. It was great going into a house where pattern wasn't scary to them. So we were able to work with a lot of different finishes to really create that warmth, find a way of nesting them in a new sense for that space, and also still really honoring some of those things in a way that he had loved when she was still around. And I think, in a very nod to this image, it's like finding bridges is something that we are constantly trying to do for our clients because we don't always know what they want. So we have to find these little tidbits of, he really likes San Francisco. San Francisco Bridge is obviously awesome. I couldn't get him to pick art. I'm like, well, let's find a photograph and blow it up and then do something that is just super engaging on that wall. And he loved it. And so finding that bridge for us that gets people excited is really the most important part of what we do, because these spaces are not ours, they are theirs, and we want to make sure they feel like them and feel like home for them. So fulfillment through renovation is a little different. Going into someone's home that they exist in already, there's obviously a built-up history to that. Going into a space that is not theirs and needs renewal and needs refreshed, that's something very different. And I don't think if most of our clients who were going to start that type of project knew what they were getting into, they probably never would. This house is in Lafayette Square and has been a pretty big part of our starting of our career, because these are also friends. We saw this house, we're like, we need to be a part of this. But it wasn't great. It was a beautiful home. But walking into it, there was literally, I couldn't find the photo, but there was literally a tree sprout shooting up in one of their bedrooms. And it's amazing to see in the span of 10 years, the house that had been loved and cared for, that person had passed away, and unfortunately it wasn't able to be cared for the same. And this is what we walked into. This is what we were able to do with it, which is, it was great. And I think for us, we really relied on some of the restrictions that the house presented to us, where the client originally wanted to expand this kitchen and make it huge. For historic tax purposes, we could not do that. And we actually were excited by that because it didn't want to be huge. This house needed something different. And this space for the most part, allowed for us to really engage the beauty that was there and not force the hand. And for us, that really created these prolific moments throughout, where the history of the home connected with the design that we were putting into it, with then the client's personal taste. Because, of course, gray was very popular when we were doing this. They wanted gray everywhere. We're like, we can't quite do it that way. And so we just started tweaking some of what that was and going through that process to figure out, okay, how do we blend what the house wants as its own client to make this project really work, and utilizing materials that felt consistent with the home, and then playing with those to then provide the color scheme from there, it really layered itself in a really beautiful way to really feel opulent, to feel modern, but also still feel like we were honoring the place and honoring what it meant to be a new tenant in this historic home. And the materials themselves are just really awesome for the space, but it also was very hard to convince the contractor and the client that even though you're staring into this bathroom and you see the shower, if we do a beautiful enough shower, it won't matter. And if we do it so you can see through it, most people will love it. And we had to fight really hard to get this bathroom arranged the way we wanted. And we went through all the iterations and we went back to the first concept, which is this. So that was it's always our challenge of trying to figure out how to get clients on board with some of the things that really make sense for them that they don't always know right away. But then there is this question, to renovate or not to renovate? That is something that we always struggle with when meeting a client for the first time, because sometimes we're going into their home that really does make sense for them, they just don't know how to live in it yet. And then sometimes they're looking to scale. And sometimes that's not always the most exciting thing. As you can see in this floor plan, this was new construction. It was being done with a builder. And we did massage the layout a bit. But this is something that we ended up going back post-mortem on this project because it never actually got completed in our office. And we wanted to say, what would happen if we actually, new construction is sometimes challenging because it doesn't have, you have to build that. And for us, we wanted to explore what that meant in a way that, obviously white kitchens are very popular right now. How do we want to layer some additional texture and warmth to that? And this house was quite large, and often in that case, you have to figure out how breaking down those spaces and using the material palette as a instigator for creating comfort and warmth and creating that history that everyone loves about historic homes, but it's often not something you find in new construction, which is something that for us, finding fulfillment in this industry, I think eventually is going to be really getting into turnkey construction, where we do from start to finish everything from the actual construction down to the landscaping all the way to the furniture. So we did a competition not too long ago to really explore what it was to deal with an efficient setup for a single-story, single-family home over Olive. And that was something that was interesting to go through the process because it wasn't a huge budget for what it was. The one that won, actually, it was going to be 3 times the price to construct, but it looked beautiful. But for our iteration, we're like, what can we do on a budget? And what does that mean for the person who lives there? So obviously exploring these themes of mid-century, planning what that looked like as a structure, and still trying to create something that still felt fresh and modern, but had some layering of history for what that could mean for that area. But for us, that wasn't entirely, it's not exactly what we want to do for exploring. So fulfillment through this exploration of what does that mean for us as a business, not thinking about that as a client, but thinking of us as a client, and thinking of our first home that we owned, which was a townhouse off of Cherokee Street. And we loved the layout of that house. The architect who had gone in to do that renovation was fairly receptive to the space, and I think it probably was still fairly different from what it originally had been 100 years ago, but we found the layout of that space to be kind of intriguing. And we wanted to find a way of modernizing that, still within a budget, still thinking about being cost effective, and what does that mean? Sometimes the material palette is really the hardest part in that, so you have to be very careful how much you're doing with that and not over engineering. So this was kind of our first attempt of the layout that we had loved in our own home, and what would that mean if we were to do new construction at an efficient scale. But of course, we always want to power things up to the next level and create something that feels a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more detailing to it. And does that, something clearly others are going to want that too. So just finessing that a bit. Again, this is not a typical townhouse, but we wanted to sort of push and pull within a city lot, and then also provide additional space outdoor obviously something that most people want. And so for us, we were trying to just go through and explore what that could look like, kind of at a base level, and then also knowing that the reality right now is additional sources of income. Also, have family in town, having that carriage house sort of scenario in the back is a very same thing. A space that you could rent out an Airbnb or do something for actual longer term rental. So we kind of just explored this idea of turnkey, which is different than watching HGTV. They make it look so easy, and I wish it was. And for many of our clients, that is something that we are always trying to explain why it's different, and going through that whole evaluation usually proves it. But it's not like watching a show and then all of a sudden it just works. I wish I could say that Fixer Upper was the reality. But most of our clients who do get really into that, like, well, I've watched an episode, I can be a designer. It's like, sure. But for us, that demographic is how we are trying to find fulfillment through sales, because the reality of our industry is that's how we make money, and that's how we do better design, by producing. And that really is what the Warehaus by Nistenhaus. That was kind of our approach of taking this concept of everyone needs these goods for their homes. We want to sell them, and I think for us, of what it means to do architecture and interior design, but put that into a footprint for a showroom that is more about lifestyle and is more about utilizing that. So again, coming up with a name, always fun, but really we are taking this concept from 1800s of having a warehouse, W-A-R-E-H-A-U-S, but taking those and meshing them to really show people's wares, both ours as well as many local artists, makers, and then utilizing the Lemp Brewery, which has is steeped in history and architecture, and the space itself really does lend itself to many different styles. So Art Deco as a inspirational point for us, trying to figure out what that space wants to look like when it's fully filled out. Art Deco is something that, as a style, St. Louis is very responsive to. But for Justin and myself, maximalism is something that we are a little bit more drawn to as a concept, and especially presenting to clients. This layered approach to just packing in as much beautiful design as you can. The more is more approach is fun in theory. It's not for everyone. This is definitely something that could be way too dramatic for some, and we like the idea of having vignettes of this in that warehouse space. But also, minimalism is something that our backgrounds in architecture, we can't get away from minimalism. And that's probably because it's just steeped in the history of what it means to be a designer in the modern era. Everyone knows the Mies chair, or really Eames chair, which is the next slide. But having kind of this mid-century meets minimalism, there's different ways of layering that, and minimalism bleeds very heavily into what mid-century was, partially because I think the product design changed. It changed for the consumer, and that consumer lives differently than your designers. So this is actually Charles and Ray Eames' personal studio, and Justin and I are often very responsive to this aesthetic because it feels like I want to be in that space. I want to enjoy that. But of course, glam, also a huge part, not to be confused with Wham, again, 80s baby, and George Michael, come on. Kelly Wersler as a designer, that is this space, which is a hotel, really showcases what it means to do, I think, a culmination of all of these different styles in a very glamorous way. And it really is about sumptuous textures, playing with pattern, playing with scale, and playing with architecture, which for us, we feel like that's something that eventually the Warehouse will really be able to showcase. But if anyone's ever watched Ab Fab, most people in this audience probably haven't. It's a hilarious British show, and the entire thing about it is people, shopping, fashion, all of these things. It's Christian Lacroix, sweetie, which that's what this is. It's more funny if you know the show. But really, consumers are very much based in what gets them excited. And for us, pattern and color and that play of all of it into one. Christian Lacroix is a very prolific designer and is a fashion designer to start, but then basically gets into interior design by way of a lot of these materials, and probably one of my favorite wallpaper lines. But this all takes money, and so we do not have daddy and our sugar mama, and that's something that for us, finding ways of really producing this and getting the money to do these projects for ourselves is, again, finding ways of monetizing what we're able to do, not trying to bastardize it as a concept, but really trying to take it and what is the way of selling a lifestyle to a client. And this is actually the raw space as you see it right now today. It is truly raw space, but we do have many things in there that we have, a $50,000 rug sitting on one end of it, and then we have some vintage pieces and antique pieces sitting on the other end, and really meshing all of those in a way that feels approachable. You go into the space, most people are in awe of the actual, the volume of that space is, another twice the size of this. They find that to be encouraging and something that feels approachable somehow, even though it's like you shouldn't be there. They want to be there, and that for us is what we keep trying to figure out how to really work with and figure out how to explore, because it definitely brings energy to our business and fulfillment to our business. So really, as a structure to wrap this all up, I myself am a bit of a shell company, and I find myself always bridging between all of these different businesses. Nistenhaus, which then gets into this residential versus commercial, and then eventually into the turnkey, into the large-scale development, versus these other business ventures, which just pigeonhole nicely into what our business is with Verde on Cherokee and the Warehaus. I, like many entrepreneurs, have a funny way of not actually being able to separate between business and personal. And so for me, all of this is part of me, and I find fulfillment through doing all of them all at once. It doesn't always make it easy. It often makes it very difficult, but there is a lot of joy in what we do, partially because every part of it is layered in this path that we've taken. And I think it's just the fulfillment through facilitation. And I think that's something that I have found that often when having these conversations about anything, people want to look at everything as very linear, as how do I get across this in a very smooth way? And the reality is life is like a puzzle. It's not about getting to the finish line, it's about organizing all of these pieces into a highly rendered image. And the reality is it really isn't finished until you kind of get that last piece, you put it in and the lights go out. So that's kind of how I view this larger context of what we do, and how I keep myself from going crazy every time I think that I'm not doing enough. I really have to, and others push me with this as well, but trying to get outside of my head on that, which is a challenge on a good day. But here's a cat. So it's like, get out of your head. This is actually Archer. Full name, Sir Archer Bojangles. And I think that's something that for us, I do want to say thank you, because this has been fulfilling for me to go through what it has been to be a designer within this. We're done. And what has been a designer in this current post-pandemic, pre-pandemic, current pandemic place, and going through and seeing all of these different threads that I've done throughout the years, and seeing how much they go together. So that is what I got.
Thank you very much. We have a little bit of time for some Q&A, question and answer. Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask Michael but not me? Mike Spikowski, you have a question.
How have you managed to be friends with Aaron for so long?
Sabrina.
That's everybody's answer.
No, we actually, the funny thing about us was meeting, technically, yes, Sabrina. She had come into the store that I was at, working at, and very easy to work with. Sabrina's a fantastic client. Kind of knows what she wants. She wants someone else to help figure it out. And ultimately, we were going through that process, and she's like, oh, you know what? My boyfriend really has an opinion on these things I didn't know, so we want to bring him in. And in walks Aaron, and I'm like, oh, God, this guy. You know, come lumbering in. And then we start talking about color and fabric and texture. And I'm like, oh, we can make this work. Perfect. And we've kind of been friends ever since. So, and I officiated the wedding. So, yeah, being friends with Aaron is mainly, you just got to stroke the design ego and you're good. Yeah. So.
Let me ask you a real question. Do you find you're more inspired by constraints, with budget or size or scale, or does that
I think our office, myself in particular, creativity comes, I think, naturally. So I think it is one of those things that I don't mind a challenge. Sometimes the challenge is the exciting part and figuring out how to make it work. I do enjoy that process when you're not constraining the constraint, because I think that's one of the big challenges that we find ourselves often in is people are always layering additional things in later. And so those constraints, I think, are initially fun. And I have many clients who are a little bit more crazy in their design aesthetic, and that can be its own constraint, but it is fun to, when they get the enjoyment out of it, that's something that's what we live for. So, or that's what I live for a bit. So yes and no. Anyone else? Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about Verde on Cherokee and what that space is like?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, completely. So Verde on Cherokee was actually a culmination of us trying to really understand that space. And again, the greenhouse space, I encourage, there's a website. You're welcome to come down to our space throughout the week. We're open. But it is a really beautiful greenhouse space. And because of that, everyone walks in there like, oh, you guys should do events. And we're like, we do. There are a lot of weddings, birthdays, and other things that happen there. And that space is really just working off of, it's a great example of how architecture, if you engage it the right way, just naturally works. And we've had so many different functions. It's not for all intents and purposes, it shouldn't work because it's not the biggest space. But most people, that intimacy that it provides, and the fact that you have all these plants around you, we keep trying to layer in more with it, and have been able to work in a few vendors that actually that's what they do. And I feel like just that living environment is something that I think a lot of people are drawn to. So of course we're hypercritical of it. Like it's not exactly the way we want it to be. But the beautiful part is people can go into that space and make it their own. And that's been the concept behind Verde is we don't try to constrict it. We try to leave it fairly open. We have a package built for 2 things. People can rent it hourly. And we have a lot of photographers. That space is so awesome for photographers because it gets so much light, obviously. But it's just that type of light that comes from that greenhouse. It's always amazing to see what the photographers do with that space. And you look on the screen, you're like, that does not look like it. But that's what other people get to see, and it's fun to utilize that for that. But really, it's just a cool greenhouse that we're just utilizing. So I don't know if that answers the question. Okay. Anyone else? Cool. Oh, yeah.
I appreciate you mentioning maximalism because sometimes my wife and I collect a lot of things on her time. Sometimes we try to lean towards minimalism because it's a very millennial way, but we have a lot of personality and a lot of maximalism. Collected and whatnot, especially throughout quarantine, we were living in that space a lot, and we rearranged stuff so much just to make it more functional. How do you approach maximalism while being practical for a person's living space and personality?
So practicality and design don't always go hand in hand. In many ways, for us, in our own space, it's almost about trying things. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges for us in this industry. We can put something on a floor plan and it will make no sense. And we're like, all right, we have to remove stuff. You get it into the space and you show that as a package and you're like, oh, now we don't have enough stuff. And I feel like that's one of the things that we have always struggled with, trying to get that pre-built, like, this is everything you need, client, here you go, take it and run, which is why we like maximalism as a concept. It is about layered history. So it may not be a one-size-fits-all in that moment, but taking and constantly going through that iterative approach, I think is how we have done it. And I think it's like, it's throwing paint at a canvas, basically. I think maximalism is the artist's version of interior design. Let's put as much as we can on that canvas, and if we don't like something, we'll just remove it. We'll just add on top of it again. And I think that layering approach makes a lot of people really anxious because they're afraid of making mistakes, and that's the beauty of maximalism. There are no mistakes, because ultimately if you don't like something, you just move it to another place. And I feel like that is some of our clients who are easiest to work with for like getting things produced to a point that feels like them. They just collect. They collect things they love. They don't worry about where it's going to go, because they know eventually they'll find a place, which is amusing that sometimes that place is in their basement. And we'll go searching in people's homes. I always say, we're going shopping in your house. Because there's like, oh, I don't want you to use that. And it's like, no, this is really beautiful, and this is how we can use it. And people get the biggest kick of us going and finding things that they didn't think were worthwhile to display, and displaying it in a way that actually is very potent and very prominent in their space. And it is fun when you realize, oh, I got this thing that was their grandparents, and I displayed it, and now that brings out that memory. So that, I would say, is not being afraid to make the wrong decision and collect things you love, and you will never dislike anything in your house. So, yeah. Yeah.
What's your least favorite interior design trend right now?
So the PC answer is all trends have validity. If you enjoy it, I think you should do it. So we're not afraid of doing certain things. I do dislike the fact that it seems like there is that sort of shabby chic country shiplap scenario that has just gotten out of hand. There's a time and a place, and I feel as though that's one of the things that, and like white cabinetry, I think there's a time and a place. I think when people do something that's a trend because they don't yet know themselves, and they're like, well, I see this, and I think that is something for me. We're constantly having to talk people off the ledge of, I want to paint my whole house white. I'm like, don't, because it photographs beautifully, but it doesn't actually live well. So I think that's probably the trend right now of people really getting stuck in Pinterest and Instagram and trying to find their personality through others without actually doing the work to figure out who they are. That's why designers exist. But I think that's whitewashing everything and trying to make it look like something that it isn't. That's probably the biggest challenge right now. So, yeah.
Do you have a hard time incorporating like some of those more trendy designs in an architectural space that doesn't fit that, or doesn't fit that era, or style?
No, I think it's partially our backgrounds in architecture have allowed us, I think, to have a different language than just interior design. So we like the mix. Again, maximalism for us isn't always about just a ton of, I think maximalism often gets stuck in this traditional look. I think for us it is really about those layers. And I feel if you throw, it's like an outfit. You throw enough stuff at it, and if you know how to tweak it just right, you can make something look fairly put together that is extremely chaotic. And I feel like taking design, different cues from different eras, and putting them into one space is not complicated if you know what you're doing. Again, like picking paint color. If someone has enough going on, I can pick that in like a 5-minute period. But if they are struggling to really understand what that style is, it really is, what are you trying to do with it? And I think that's where we're constantly trying to understand when someone presents us like, oh, I love mid-century. You're like, great, what do you love about it? Like, well, I like Eames chair. It's like, well, that's not only mid-century. Mid-century is all of these other things. And I think that vocabulary is probably the bigger struggle, is if somebody says, I want mid-century in a U-City bungalow, yeah, we could do that because those aren't inherently that different. But if they say, no, I really want this image right here, I need this in my bungalow, you're like, that doesn't make sense because you don't have 2-story ceilings. And I think we always start with architecture. Architecture and how those styles mesh are how we really formulate the kind of groundwork from building upon that. And I think that has been what makes it the most easy for us to mesh those styles that don't always want to mesh. And using historic homes, again, the Lafayette Square property, those guys love mid-century. And again, really liked gray. We really had to be careful how we did it. And luckily, they were on board for going through that, what it was to pick color to fit their space that still felt like them. And it was very different than probably any house in Lafayette Square, for better or worse. Some people don't like that. But no, I think knowing how to mix those things in a way that feels consistent, I think starting with architecture, or at least starting with a grounding point, any space that we work on, if someone doesn't have a particular aesthetic they're drawn to, I usually force them to pick a pillow or a rug or a piece of art that gives us a grounding point. So if we build our rug, it's our island that we then get to build from, and making sure not to do too small of a rug, because if you have a small island and you're trying to throw everything else on it and it doesn't fit, you're all going to drown. So I think that's trying to really start with a basis that gives you a really good foundation, and then really anything can be built from that with the right sensibilities. Cool. Well, I do appreciate it. Can I mention the event?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead, Randy, because I was going to ask you a question.
Yeah. So May 6th, oh, I'm sorry, I keep touching this thing. May 6th, we actually have an event at the Warehouse. So that is coming up within a week here. It's from 5 to 8, and it's going to be a really great event because we have been working towards, we're actually, I don't know if anyone knows Gus Modern, but it's a pretty big company for us to be bringing in for St. Louis. But we have all of these other companies that we already show in that space, but we're also bringing in a lot of vendors to that event as well. So people who do jewelry, some fashion, some just locally made items. So it should be a fun event. It is also Derby themed, because why not? Kentucky Derby happens that weekend, I believe. And then also Cherokee Street has Cinco de Mayo going the next day. So if anyone is wanting to check out the Warehouse, it's not always open. So that next Friday from 5 to 8 it will be. And it is on Instagram and on Facebook too. So, but I appreciate you all coming, and hopefully this was helpful or interesting.
Not so bright early.